We thought it would be important to offer you a panel conversation on what we believe is a very important topic, the outlook for international business and how the outcome of the current presidential race may impact our clients, as well as the global economy and the economic outlook for each of your countries. There have been a number of factors recently, both political and the markets, that make this a complicated moment for business to navigate. And today, we have assembled a group of experts, including 2 of our own partners from the UK and the Netherlands, to offer you some perspective on these issues. Now, I was taught one time that the importance of an introduction, the length of it is directly inversely proportional to the importance of the person. And I once had the opportunity to introduce LeBron James to a crowd. And so, quite frankly, I looked at the crowd and I said, well, here's LeBron James. I mean, I didn't know what to say. So, here's Newt Gingrich.
Well, thank you for that generous and warm introduction. I thought, in terms of business, let me go at it from 3 different areas. To the degree that the United States is still a relatively major locomotive in pulling the economy forward, my guess is, and I'm going to talk primarily about a Trump presidency, my guess is that Trump would actually represent a dramatic acceleration of American economic growth. And that a great deal of his entire program, from infrastructure development to tax policy to regulatory policy to energy policy, would all be driving at the idea of getting a Reagan-style 5, 6, 7% a year growth. And to the degree that in America growing at that rate is by definition useful to the world economy, it'll be powerful. The second area you have to think about is trade. And I want to dispel one of the dumber things that people sometimes write about in the media. You know, as you may have noticed, the day after the Brexit vote, Donald Trump was at Turnberry in Scotland because he owns it. He could also have been in Panama City, Panama, because he has a Trump Towers. He could have been in Dubai because he has a Trump Towers. Eric, actually his son, who's going to speak tonight, spends a great deal of his time developing international business for the company. I mean, so the idea that he's in any way an isolationist is crazy. This is a guy who has a very thorough understanding that the world market matters. He has a pretty good understanding of tourism. And I think that he has a pretty good understanding of job creation. But he believes that American trade negotiators have been amazingly incompetent. And I can tell, look, I am in favor of the largest possible trading system in the world. I was the whip for the Republican side on passing NAFTA. I actually got more votes in the House than Gore and Clinton did. And I'm very willing to defend the international order. But I will also tell you, it's currently, partly because of what happened to us coming out of World War II. Because we were the only country that wasn't bombed among the industrial countries, we came out of World War II as about 50% of the world GDP in 1946. And that was obviously unsustainable, and we knew it was unsustainable, and that's why you get the Marshall Plan. You get a variety of other things. But in the process, we acquired a set of habits that are now not sustainable. And so I think you've got to really look at various patterns. You've got to look at the degree to which the European Union very intelligently uses regulatory policy to minimize American capabilities. I've been involved in one a tiny issue involving bananas for over 20 years. Where the American banana company has a real problem because of discrimination. You watch the European Union's attitude towards Google and towards Facebook and towards large American companies. You know, but that's fine. Then maybe we'll figure out what Europe's really good at, and we should do the same thing. But so one, I'm very happy to talk about real trade negotiations, but I'm not particularly willing to be lectured about free trade. Second, you look at China. The Director of National Intelligence staff reported 6 weeks ago that China last year stole $360 billion in intellectual property. That's twice the size of our total sales to China. Now, why would you want to follow a trade regime in which your largest economic competitor on the planet gets away with that kind of behavior, and you're supposed to pretend that it's really okay? Now, how Trump will work this out, I have no idea. I tell everybody, you will not know what he's doing every morning because he will not know what he's doing every morning. This is not because he's stupid. It's because he's a very dynamic businessman who believes in responding in virtually real time to changing developments. And he is a ruthless negotiator. I recommend to all of you that you get 2 books if you want to understand him and report back to your home government. One is The Art of the Deal, which is was a New York Times bestseller for a year in the 1980s, is a remarkably good, solid business book. And the other is The Art of the Comeback, which is a fascinating study of how he recovered from being virtually destroyed in the early 1990s, and the steps he took and how he took them and the lessons he learned. When you read those 2 books, you realize this is a very sophisticated person. And this is a guy who went from real estate in Manhattan to golf courses worldwide, to casinos, to hotels, to at one time the largest selling tie in the United States, to the #1 TV show, The Apprentice, for 13 years. You know, and just package all this stuff together and say, so you think this guy's dumb? No, he's different. I mean, part of what marks him off is he's different. He really shakes a lot of Republicans, because a lot of people became Republican to live in an orderly world. You know, they like being in a board of directors suite. They like being in a traditional country club. This guy is literally a blue-collar billionaire. He spent a lot of his time working, building buildings, talking to the guy down and the woman down on the street who was building it. Actually hired the first woman to build a high-rise in New York, put her in charge of the company. And so he talks at a 4th grade level. Why does he talk at a 4th grade level since he's a Wharton graduate? He does it because he learned over the years, if you speak at about a 4th grade level, everybody understands you. And it requires you to use a common language which you can't, you know, if you're sophisticated enough, you can use a lot of big words that have no meaning but sound really good, so by the time you're done, the person won't know what you said. You can't do that at a 4th grade level. And so Trump really specializes in that. The other point I'd make is that he is the most sophisticated user of social media in American politics. And this is something people just don't understand. You know, Jeb Bush, who was a very fine governor, would have been a very good candidate in a normal year, raised about $110 or $120 million. And they spent a ton of it attacking Trump. Didn't matter. Trump spent virtually nothing on advertising because he wakes up in the morning, he does a couple of tweets before he gets out of bed. He has 7 or 8 million followers on Twitter, including every reporter. So his tweets get magnified in the news media instantaneously. Then he goes downstairs. He doesn't drink coffee, so I presume he gets orange juice or something. And he calls into Fox and Friends. Does 9 or 10 minutes. Then he calls into Morning Joe. Does 9 or 10 minutes. Then he has breakfast and thinks about what would be a good thing to do around 10 or 11 to make news. So he makes news about 10 or 11. Then he thinks, am I going to do an hour with Greta tonight, or an hour with Sean, or a long session with somebody else? And so he goes and he gets an hour of free TV time. Now, in the course of the day, he's just generated something on, and he also, by the way, does a daily feed on his Facebook page, which reaches about 8 million people for free. And so this machine, which is just him, I mean, it's not a complicated machine, it's him, dominates political media in the United States. As president, I suspect he will be president a lot like he's a candidate. He'll be constant energy, a slightly obscure American reference for some of you. The best way to think of Trump is he's 1/3 Andrew Jackson, who was the most disruptive figure in American presidential history, 1/3 Theodore Roosevelt, who had endless energy, and 1/3 P.T. Barnum, who sold every single day. And Trump actually kind of likes that analogy. He's open. He's a salesman. He wants to know what are prices. So, for example, he's going to be for a huge infrastructure program. And that's good to him because he can go sell it. He understands how to sell a big infrastructure program. So on trade, what you're going to have is a guy who's very aggressive about negotiations, very aggressive about American exports, but very sophisticated. He has no interest in breaking up the world market. He just has a real interest in balancing the patterns under which it currently operates. The last area where I think he will be really important and really different is terrorism. And as you can tell from the last couple of weeks, that's really important. Terrorism is beginning to be ubiquitous enough that it is a drag on the world economy. I mean, you know, just ask the number of people who are a little worried about going through Istanbul right now. Turkish Air is arguably one of the best airlines in Europe. But I'll bet you they're suffering dramatic decline in people willing to change planes in Turkey, just because it feels wrong. And so I think there's a real challenge here to have a dramatically more aggressive and stronger position on terrorism. And I think in the long run that will actually have a significantly positive effect on trade, because you have to have safety to have free enterprise, and you have to have safety to have tourism. Otherwise, it just won't happen. And countries that have suffered from it can give you very clear indications of how rapidly tourism, for example, dries up if people think they might get killed. The other thing I suspect he will do is dramatically rebuild American military capability. We have clearly lived off of the Reagan buildup. We are clearly underfunded today. Our Navy is shrinking to a point where it can't possibly meet all of its missions. Our aircraft are increasingly old. We are not as aggressive. We're not as dominant in space as we should be. And I think you'll see a very, partly because it's also a great jobs program. I think you'll see a Reagan-style buildup of very substantial size. And on that cheerful note, I wish you a great afternoon. Thank you.
My name is John Phillips. I'm the partner in charge of Jones Day in London. I would like to jump straight in, KT, and ask you, you've heard Speaker Gingrich's remarks, but perhaps you could also give us your view on all of the world issues, that some of which he identified, the international and national concerns that might affect business, because what we're looking to do, I think, is build on his remarks and discuss how some of these issues will affect businesses here and abroad.
If I could start by saying, though, I think that for anybody who's not used to our political system, I mean, how many of you are non-Americans? Please raise your hands. They're not voting. Okay. So what you don't understand is we go through this every 4 years. I mean, we take the dirty laundry out and we show it to the public. We argue with each other like cats and dogs. But then eventually we have an election, we have a new president. And then what we do probably every 35, 40 years, and we have since the very beginning of our country in 1776, is we throw everybody out. So in 1776, we, the United States, we, the colonial powers, threw out King George. And we established the Virginia landed aristocracy that ruled the United States for 40 years. And then Andrew Jackson, who Speaker Gingrich referred to, he came in and threw out the landed aristocracy and expanded the population and the populace, and it became a more populist movement. We did the same thing in the Civil War in the 1860s. We did the same thing in 1900 with Theodore Roosevelt, who went after the monopolies, many of which started here in Cleveland. We did the same thing during World War II, and then in 1980, when I worked for President Reagan, we did the same thing again, where we have a populist candidate who challenges the establishment in Washington and goes after them, appeals to the population and the populace in a populist movement, and then we go through the routine again. We're at one of those inflection points again, where the populism of the United States, whether it's Bernie Sanders on the left or Donald Trump on the right, is saying, this is no longer Republican versus Democrat, this is Washington versus the real American people. So that's what you're seeing. We are going through one of those cycles. And whether Trump is elected this time around or not, we're still going to be in one of these grassroots national movements. This is America at its best. This is the grassroots bubbling up to affect the national leadership. It's not top down, it's bottom up. So whether it happens in November, or whether it, which is year 36 in my cycle, or whether it happens in 2020, this doesn't go away. The other thing I would do, though, is say that the worldview that this nationalist movement, American nationalist movement, is about this time around is really what we would call sort of a globalist view versus a nationalist view. And the majority of Americans who are supporting either as Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump are saying, here are the problems: open borders, lack of assimilation in a multiculturalism, And we've gutted our military, we've gutted our intelligence, we've gutted our national security, we're getting pushed around all over the world. And so that's the movement that's really going to fuel whoever the next president is. If you're representing foreign countries, you've got to look at this and scratch your head and say, wait a minute, we're now having this 4-year election. It's part of a 40-year cycle. America's talking about being great again, which was Ronald Reagan's campaign theme in 1980. What does that mean for the rest of us? And it makes you nervous because it's going to be change. And it is going to be different. But it's not necessarily different bad. What Gingrich also talked about is the unsustainability of what America's been through in the last 10 years. You know, it's unsustainable economic, it's out of kilter with spending and receipts. It's an economy that doesn't seem to get off sort of slow, and it's an international involvement which hasn't gone very well. I mean, we've been after terrorism for 15 years, and we haven't figured out how to solve it. In fact, it's gotten worse. So I would not be nervous. It's uncertain, but I would not be anxious about where this is, because at the end of all of this, whether it's a President Clinton or it's a President Trump or it's a President whoever in 2020, we are going to reestablish America's economy. We're probably going to build up our military. We're going to reassess our relations with other countries. But at the end of the day, we're not leading from behind again anymore. And if you look around the world today, I think you'd be very hard-pressed to think this is a safer and better world than it was a decade ago.
And you could take a lot of those remarks and apply them to the UK and EU context and Brexit.
It is the same national movement.
So I think I know the answer, but I think I'm going to ask you anyway, what's your view on Brexit?
Well, I'm a big believer in, I think Europe is in big trouble. Now, I'm sure I'm going to have a lot of people who are going to tweet out terrible things about me. Just go for it. But I think Europe is in real trouble. I think Europe, because it's had open borders, because it's had multiculturalism, because it's gutted its intelligence, its defense, and its law enforcement, that it's going to have a very hard time recovering from several things. One, is going to have a hard time recovering from the financial strain of the migration flows. It's going to have a very difficult time getting in front of terrorism. And economically, I don't see a lot of growth, positive growth in Europe in the years ahead. So if Britain is looking at that and says, you know, maybe the Titanic is sinking, better get off the last lifeboat. And so I think that but that's only step one. Step one is getting out of the European Union as it now exists. I would think that this is a great opportunity for the United States and Europe to have step two, which is to say, unlike President Obama, who says, Britain, you get out of Europe, you go to the back of the queue, we're not going to have a trade deal with you until, I don't know, the moon freezes. But to say, come on to the front of the queue and let's have a United States, United Kingdom relationship alliance. We have common threats, we have common beliefs, we are taking our common threats and our common advantages seriously. So I would think the next step, and I don't speak for Donald Trump and Newt Gingrich, if he can't speak for Donald Trump, I sure can't. But I think it would be a very advantageous relationship that the United States would explore to post-Brexit have a US-UK relationship, trade agreement, alliance, and potentially even more.
Okay, thank you. Lou, I ought to give you the opportunity to just say a few words about Europe in the light of KT's remarks.
The sentiment in the UK, of course, is not foreign to certain other European countries. We have very similar debates. Yes, there are differences as well, but there are concerns about the EU overregulation. The refugee crisis is a big issue in Europe at the moment. Fear for terrorism is a big issue. If I look at my own country, the Netherlands, and some commentators thought that may be the next one to vote to get out of the EU. Actually, after the Brexit vote, there's a growing majority against an exit of the Netherlands from the EU. But on the other hand, it may take just one big security issue in the country, and that may change the popular vote and the popular perception of this. So there's a lot of uncertainty. For a country like the Netherlands, it's clear it's a very small market. There's 70 million consumers. Europe offers 500 million consumers. So the Netherlands is benefiting from being part of the EU, and I think that is well understood by a large part of the population.
Mike, the orthodoxy certainly in Europe and definitely within the Remain camp during the debate has been that the EU was good for business. It made business easier for US companies working and operating in Europe. How do you look at both Brexit and maybe the dislocation of Europe and this maybe this move towards a more nationalist US? How does that affect your decision making as the leader of a global business?
Yeah, so just a little bit about the company. We're about a $6 billion company. We operate in 28 countries around the world with about 16,000 employees. So we have pretty good global reach and have, I think, a reasonably good understanding of what goes on in the world. I wish I could be more reassured by KT's encouragement to not feel anxious. I think in the business world, we feel anxious. Certainly as we talk to our employees around the world, we understand the anxiousness that our employees feel around the world about what's going on in the U.S. So I think some more certainty and more visibility on how we get from here to there is going to be very important to the decision-making environment. So it's one thing to kind of identify the vision of where we think we're going to go and say we haven't sorted out all the details of how we're going to get from here to there. I think in business, obviously the details matter, and we make long-term capital decisions, we make long-term employment decisions based on where we see stability, where we see opportunity, where we see growth. Obviously, as a manufacturer, scale and capital investment are critical to our competitiveness. So we like big markets where we can build bigger scale assets so that those assets have the opportunity to run more efficiently. So kind of a balkanization of the global trade that caused the advantage to go to smaller assets and less scale, less efficient assets, I think would be very disruptive to economic growth. I think it'd be very disruptive to taking people out of poverty and creating wealth around the world. And certainly be very chilling to our desire to make capital investments. So I think you'd see a big pullback if there were a lot of uncertainty around trade, the decisions of where and how to invest, where and how to employ. And I think, you know, it's important for politicians to keep in mind when we hire somebody, we think about them as having a 30 or 40-year career with our company. When we build an asset, we think about the value of that asset over 30 or 40 years. And when you're in a period of this amount of uncertainty, it's very hard to make any of those decisions and really want to move forward. So I think getting through this period of rhetoric and getting to a period of real policies that produce real economic growth is very important.
What happens if one of the first things, which Trump has talked about, and it's in his economic plan, you go to the website, where he talks about an immediate major significant cut in American corporate tax rates, so that we go from being the highest corporate tax rate to the lowest, and maybe some, you know, the details again he leaves up to somebody else, but we get to the highest to the lowest, and we may even have a moratorium, or we may have a forgiveness, bring the money back, you don't get taxed on that at all. What does that do for the American economy and the world economy? I mean, to me, that looks pretty good.
Well, I mean, I think we've all seen legislatively how difficult it is to get any meaningful tax reform. So I think for a presidential candidate to promise that, you'd want to feel a momentum of unifying around those ideas that gave you the impression he could actually get that done.
I went for Ronald Reagan, you know, so don't tell me how, I mean, it worked.
If Donald Trump's Ronald Reagan, I think we're in good shape.
Lou, yesterday, I wasn't there, but we held a Jones Day discussion on American competitiveness and tax and trade policy. How do you look at likely US tax policy from a European viewpoint?
So John, I can give a perspective from a practitioner that deals with some of those issues on a daily basis. I won't get into the US politics, but what Katie was saying about the cycles here, and the last real tax reform in the US was in 1986. And clearly I wasn't around practicing tax law at the time, but at that point in time, the US introduced a very competitive tax system with some of the lowest rates in the world. And if you now look around in this room, I think there may only be one ambassador that's present here that represents a country with a higher rate than the US rate. And of course, when it comes to competing for businesses and location choices, corporate tax rates matter a lot. We see that on a daily basis. It drives decisions where capital investments are being made and businesses are taking rational decisions. And with the highest rate, if that will come down, and that's part of what I understand is the proposal, but businesses need certainty around that. And as long as there's no certainty, they cannot take those decisions. And we are at a point in time that there's building, that the OECD and the G20 have been building international consensus on some new international tax standards. that are intended to counter what is perceived as aggressive tax planning. And as a result of that, a lot of large US multinationals have to take long-term decisions as to their corporate structure and their location choices that are not that easily reversible if tax reform were to happen. And so the timing here may be off.
Okay. And Mike, do you see the impact of these fabled theoretical trade agreements that governments negotiate with each other? Do you see the impact on your business on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, probably the agreement in my lifetime that I've had that's had the most impact, in terms of our decision making would have been NAFTA. And if you went back 25 years ago, my company had operations in Canada that served Canada, operations in the U.S. that served the U.S., and operations in Mexico that served Mexico. And over the course of the last 20 years, we probably have about the same employment in those three countries, maybe a little bit more employment today in Mexico than we had. But those assets have been reconfigured step by step, investment by investment, in order to make them fit for use based on the market opportunity we saw. So some of our Canadian assets were smaller because that market was smaller, so they're making more specialty products. We had some more labor-intensive products that we've increasingly invested in Mexico, and some of our best technology and most skilled workforce has ended up in the U.S. product line and scale facilities. That was a 25-year metamorphosis in that asset base, and I think things like TPP or the European Union has created those same step-by-step incremental changes to the way companies are built. How you would work your way backwards from that, or how you would unwind some of those things if you went to a more bilateral system, very difficult for us to understand from a planning point of view.